Good to have each one this morning. Last week we talked about leap year, I guess more specifically leap day. And then I guess this morning we're going to talk a little bit about leap hour. Right? We all are here this morning. Obviously we did not forget to set our clocks up an hour. So we jumped ahead an hour. When I come out this morning, just a little before 7, it's usually dark when I get here, but I mean it was dark. Usually the sun is just fixing to start coming up when I'm here, but it was dark, so I knew that the new time had arrived and the daylight savings time was in full swing. I hope you went to bed a little earlier than usual last night, since you lost an hour, technically, of sleep. Or else you may miss the message this morning. You might be a little sleepy, a little groggy, and you might miss out on the message this morning. In fact, the title of the lesson will be, Don't Miss the Message. A lot of time people hear a lot of things taught from the Word of God, but they don't really grasp the entirety of it. You know, there are several different ways that we can look at the same story and learn different things from it. I'm reminded of a cut diamond. You know, you can look at a cut diamond in the sunlight, and it's according to which direction you're looking at that diamond, it sometimes casts off different colors. The same diamond, but seen from different points of view, can indeed look very differently. That's kind of the ideal of the lesson this morning. Be turning with me, if you would, to the book of 2 Kings. We're going to look at a very well-known story, a story that over the last 33 years I know I've used in different lessons, and we've looked at it from different perspectives. We're going to read this story this morning one more time and see if you've seen all the messages that this story holds. 2 Kings chapter 5, I'd like to read, if you'll follow in the reading with me, the first 19 verses of that chapter. Now, Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance into Syria. He was also a mighty man in valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, Thus and thus saith the little maid that is of the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, Go, and I will send a letter unto the king of Israel. And he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 pieces of gold and 10 changes of raiment. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, saying, Now, when this letter is come unto thee, behold, I have therewith sent Naaman, my servant, to thee, that thou mayest recover him of his leprosy. And it came to pass, when the king of Israel had read the letter, that he rent his clothes and said, Am I God? To kill, to make alive, that this man does send me to recover a man of leprosy? Wherefore consider, I pray you, and see how he seeketh a quarrel against me. And it was so, when Elisha, the man of God, had heard that the king of Israel had rent his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Wherefore hast thou rent thy clothes? Let him come now to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and with his chariot, and stood at the door of the house of Elisha. And Elisha sent a messenger unto him, saying, Go and wash in Jordan 7 times, and thy flesh shall come again to thee, and thou shalt be clean. But Naaman was wroth, and went away, and said, Behold, I thought, he will surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and strike his hand over the place, and recover this leper. Are not Alma and Pharpar rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? May I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spake unto him, and said, My father, if the prophet had bid thee to do some great thing, wouldest thou not have done it? How much rather then, when he said to thee, Wash and be clean? Then went he down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh came again like unto the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, and he and all of his company, and he came and stood before him and said, Behold, now I know that there is no God in all of the earth, but in Israel. Now therefore I pray thee, take a blessing of thy servant. But he said, As the Lord liveth, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And Naaman said, Shall there not then, I pray thee, be given to thy servant 2 mules burden of earth? For thy servant will henceforth offer neither burnt offering nor sacrifice unto other gods, but unto the Lord. In this thing the Lord pardoned thy servant, that when my master goeth into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leaneth on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, when I bow down myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardoned thy servant in this thing. And he said unto him, Go in peace. So he departed from him a little way. Now, I want to stop right there just a minute. And I want to introduce the thought and the ideal of the lesson. Don't miss the message. And right away people will say, well, I've heard this lesson dozens of times. I know all about Naaman. I know all about his condition of leprosy. And I know how that he went to get his leprosy cured, and how he struggled with the ideal that he was told to go down to the old dirty river Jordan and dip 7 times, when in reality he could have just stayed home. Went and washed in one of the good, nice, crystal clear waters of his homeland, and could have been made clean. We remember the story about his lack of faith, his unwillingness to see the simplicity of God. We know that story. Okay, well, that's not the story I want to talk about this morning. And others would say, well, we could look at the king of Syria, or we could look at even at the king of Israel. And we could look at the things that are going on there. How that when the story was delivered to the king of Syria, that his servant, his valuable, honorable servant, a leader in his army, had found a means perhaps of being cured, that he very quickly says, not only am I going to give you permission to go to Samaria and to address the king there of Israel, But I'm going to send a letter with you. In fact, I'm going to send provisions with you to offer as a gift. The words and verbiage used here later on in the lesson was an offer of blessing to the king. He was sent with his provisions. But that wasn't enough. First of all, the king of Israel. Now, be reminded, the kingdom is at this point in time part of the divided kingdom, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, both being loosely governed by King Jehoram at this time. And so when he receives Nahum in his presence and is asked to heal him of his leprosy and to accept these gifts, he gets a little nervous and he says, wait a minute, is he picking at me? He knows that I'm not God. He knows that I don't have any mystical or magical powers of healing. Is he trying to pick a fight with me? So he was all nervous and out of sorts with the king of Assyria. And we've heard that story. But that's not the lesson for this morning. And we know how that when Elisha heard what was going on, he said, well, tell him to come to my house, and I will show and prove that there is indeed a prophet of God in Israel. And then Elijah didn't even have the courtesy to come out to this honorable man. Yes, he was a Syrian, but an honorable man, a leader in this country. But sent out a messenger. And how disrespectful that was received by the hand of Nahum. And he got a little upset over it, but ultimately did what he was told anyway. And we know that story. But that's not even the message for this morning. And we know how that once Nahum got a little upset and some of his very own servants came to him, how that they said, listen, you're not looking at this right. Now, what if this man had told you to do some big thing, some huge thing? You would have done it. But yet he tells you something very simple. He just says, hey, go down to the river Jordan, dip 7 times, you'll be healed. What's so hard about that? Now, they didn't say it. I take a little liberty here. I think they were saying to the boss, like, quit whining. Quit pouting about this. You got your feelings hurt. They didn't have a big parade for you and have some real big outlandish thing. They just said, go wash in the river. Why don't you just go wash in the river? Try it. Won't cost you anything. So ultimately he went down and washed. And upon the 7th time of him coming up, indeed, the Bible says his skin returned clean and fresh as a child's skin. But that's not the lesson. That's not the message that we want to talk about from the story this morning. We could go on to talk about, reading from verse 20 on, there was also a servant there of Elisha, Gehazi, that had seen the gift offered to Elisha, who, by the way, refused the lavish gifts and said, I serve God. I don't do what it is I do for self-gain. I serve God. It was God that did this for you. This was God's words and God's doing. I don't receive pay for that. But Gehazi said, hey, wait a minute. If he don't want it, no use in wasting all that silver and gold and those fine changings of clothes. Maybe I could go down and work out a deal with him and get some of that for myself. And we see the greed that's there. But that's not the message that I want to talk about this morning. We see people of faith. We see people without faith. We see people who by their stubborn ego almost allowed themselves a disservice. We see people of greed all of these various things we see in this story. We've heard lessons about all of these things in this story, but that's not the message this morning. There's another message, very seldom taught, probably by all rights, the biggest message of this story. But if you're still a little drowsy this morning, if you didn't get all your sleep, you might have missed it. Let's start over. Come back to verse 2 with me, and let's just read just a couple of verses there. If you will, see if you pick up where the real message is in this story. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, just a little girl. And she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, that is Naaman's wife, would God my Lord were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. And one went in and told his Lord, saying, thus and thus saith the maid that is in the land of Israel. Well, look at there. There's a little girl in Syria. She is a slave in the house of Naaman. She's a little Israelite that had been taken captive. Now, remember I said that the nation of Israel was a divided nation. At this point in time, the northern kingdom had fallen to the Assyrians. The southern kingdom had fallen to the Babylonians. And so here we find them at this time. They weren't a large crowd. In fact, the disbursement of them were far greater than those that were in captivity. But the lesson this morning for us is that God doesn't make mistakes. God has a plan for everything, and God will utilize us in His plan if we will so let Him. As big as this story is about Naaman, and it's a big story. As big as this story is about both the king of Syria, the king of Israel. As big as this story is about the servants of all combined. Even as big as the story is about the prophet of God. Because at this moment, in this time, Elijah was a mighty man. He was literally holding Israel together, even though they were a divided kingdom. But the biggest story here is about this little girl who was a slave, who yet retained her faith in God. How many of us during our darkest moments of life still trust God? Still believe in God? Now, that was the introduction this morning. I'd like to share with you for a few minutes about the message. And this is the message this morning. This is the good news that comes from this little girl. First of all, I would dare say about this little girl that she was someone who was compassionate. She was compassionate. She could have said, I owe these people no allegiance at all. I have been taken as a slave. I'm here to serve them, to cook for them, to clean for them, to clean up behind them. I have no rights, I have no home, I have no family. I'm just simply a little slave girl who was taken from my family. But that wasn't her attitude, was it? Her attitude was, I still serve God, even though I'm a servant of this man from Syria. And she was faithful and loyal to them. Instead of being, obstinate and hateful and vengeful, she says, this man needs help. He is suffering from this leprosy and he needs help. She was compassionate. You know, that sounds a lot like our Lord, doesn't it? Even as Christ looked across Israel, across the city physically of Jerusalem and those of his brethren, knowing that they were about to betray him and crucify him, the Bible says that as he looked out across them, he had a broken heart, great compassion. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered thee under my wings, as a hen does her chickens. We understand the compassion of Christ. How that he died for those who put him to death. How that he died for those who refused to accept who he was. How he died for those who were ready to receive his miracle and his feeding, but weren't ready to receive salvation from him. He was still compassionate. This little slave girl, forced away from everything that she knew and loved, still had compassion. The Bible talks about, as Christ was about to make his final return, Luke chapter 9, verse 54 in particular, his final return back into Jerusalem, he knew for the very last time. His disciples basically told him, Lord, you're not going to do that. We're not going to allow you to do that because we know that if you go there, they're going to put you to death. You see, that's compassion for someone greater than you. How many of us understand that we are to have that level of compassion for all of mankind? For the lost. Hold on. Even for those who hate us, would do harm to us. What an impact we can make on their lives. And maybe not today or tomorrow, but ultimately the impact we can make on their lives by showing compassion to them today. We should have that same compassion. The second thing we see as we look at this little slave girl from Israel is that she was confident in God. She told her mistress, she told the wife of Naaman, said, you know, if you would tell your husband, she knew she couldn't speak to him. If you could tell your husband that if he would go over to Samaria and ask for the prophet of God, he would heal her. I know that he could heal her because my God that I serve has the power to do all things. Well, that message hasn't changed, has it? It's worded this way in the New Testament. For I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, Paul said. If you would just tell your husband to go, he'll receive a healing. Now, let us understand that when he went, he had to go believing. He had to go with a positive attitude, with a receptive attitude. In fact, he almost blew that, didn't he? When he got there, his ego kicked in and he almost missed out on a healing. How is it with us sometimes? Because of our attitude, we miss out on blessings that God has for us. Sometimes big things that God has planned for us. How many of us truly believe that our God can do everything possible? That our God can do things that with us are impossible? How many of us truly believe the power that God has? How many of us, like Paul, understand the power that's in the gospel and the Word of God? Romans 1:16. Paul says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it is the power of God unto salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. How many of us have confidence in our God? How many of us have confidence in the power of the gospel? We don't take it because we don't have confidence in ourselves. But let's not ever lose faith and confidence in the gospel. It still has the power today to save lost mankind. And then thirdly, we see that she was convincing. Notice again from our text, when she told Naaman's wife what she needed to know, it says in verse 4, and when one went in and told his Lord, saying, now, the one who went in, follow the text there, the reading what went on, and the one that went in, Naaman, to his Lord, the king, and said, thus and thus saith the little maid from Israel. She was convincing in the words that she delivered. She had confidence in what could happen. She trusted God in His power. And she had with conviction the words that were needed to be heard by this man Naaman. Again, let's be reminded. This was a Gentile. Not just a Gentile, but a Syrian, a dominant people of war in that time and day. Hold on, not just a man of war, a Syrian, a Gentile, but this was somebody who was the master, who was dominant over this little girl. Who was she to tell him anything? Well, she was convincing in her message. He believed her. Believed her so much that he went to the king and said, this little girl, my little slave that I just brought out of Israel, she said that if I go to the prophet of God in Samaria, one of those Israelites, he can heal me. Now, two things I want to notice here. First, because she was so convincing, he believed her. And because he believed so much, his king believed him. How many of us are so convinced of the truth of God's Word that we can tell someone who would in turn go and tell someone else? Remember when Christ came? When Andrew and Peter received the Word, one brother went straight to the other. He believed the words of Christ. So much that he told others, who in turn told others. How many of us believe in God enough? Believe in the truth of the gospel enough that we can present it in such a way that others too would believe it. If we can't present it because of our confidence, then do we truly believe that we're saved? Wouldn't that be a fair argument for us? Do we truly believe that God's gospel can still save man today? Then are we telling it with conviction? Are we sharing it and making others believe it so much that in turn they will teach others? And then the last thing, the message from this morning, from this young girl, is that she was the connection. Could God have sent someone else? Sure. Could He have even sent Elisha to this man? Sure. But Elisha didn't even come out of his house, remember, when Naaman come to see him. He sent a messenger of his own to tell him what to do. You see, it's not important who tells the gospel. What's important is that the gospel has been told. We're all servants. In fact, Christ Himself said that He was a servant. He wasn't the master, He was a servant. Paul said of all of the apostles, I am the least. Of all of the disciples, I am the least. We're all servants together. It does not matter who delivers the message, only that the message gets delivered. She was responsible for bringing Naaman and Elisha together. She was responsible. because she was willing to trust God. She didn't care that she was just a little girl. And he was a valiant soldier, a leader of soldiers. She didn't care that she was a slave and that he was her master. She didn't care that she was in a foreign country. She didn't care that she was dealing with someone who did not even believe in God. She told him what he needed to know. She was the connection that he needed for a change of life. Now, why I say change of life is because of this. And it's not even part of the lesson this morning, but it is part of the story. Because how this ended, the last few verses before verse 19 that we read. Just before he left Elijah, after he had obeyed and did what he was told to do. Notice what he said. His life was changed. He says, one more thing I would ask of you. When you talk to your God, which he says there is none God, no other God, except for the God of Israel. And he says, when you go and talk with your God, I ask two things from you. First of all, let me take just 2 loads of soil, of dirt from here. 2 loads so that I can take and make a holy place, because this is holy ground. This is where God's servant is. This is where God is at. Let me take 2 loads of soil back with me to my hometown. And I will bow to the Lord, the real God. That's the first thing I ask. The second thing is, on my behalf, when I get back, I know that the king is going to ask me to go in with him when he goes into worship these strange gods. And he makes by mention here Rimmon. As he goes into the temple to bow down to Rimmon, which was their number 1 god. I know that the king's going to, his verbiage was lean upon my hand. What he means is I'll have to assist him in, and the king will expect me to bow as well. Ask the Lord to forgive me when I do that. I'm doing it as a courtesy to the king, but I know that there is one God. Lives can be changed by the gospel. God can still change people's lives. But are we willing to be an instrument used for the furtherance of that gospel? This little girl may have been a young slave girl from Israel. But look how big her message was. Look at the lives that were changed. That an old soldier boy would believe her. That an old ruthless king, seasoned with battle himself, would believe her. That God would look down kindly upon her and allow someone who would be considered by others an enemy of God to be healed of something that was so detrimental in his life. Our God has not changed today. And everything that this little girl did all those years ago are things that we need to do today. We, like her today, we need to be a compassionate people upon all of mankind. Who is my neighbor? We need to be someone who is confident in God, believing that He's true to His Word and that God is able. We need to be convinced of the power of the gospel, that we believe what we believe. We can't very well sell something we don't believe. And then we need to be that person that can connect lost lives to the only one who can save their lives, and especially their souls. We need to be the hookup from heaven. We need to be the carrier of the gospel. The gospel cannot go except that we carry it. Christ tells us both in Matthew as well as in Mark that we are to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. What's our message? Is our message a message of faith? A message of lack of faith? Of doubt? Of greed? Of ego? Is our message very simple? We trust God and we do what God expects of us to do. What's your message today? If you're subject, we invite you, we encourage you